What if wars aren't really fought for freedom, democracy, or national security, but for cash flow? Think about it for a second. Every major conflict since 1945, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, the wars being prepared right now, what if they're less about ideology and more about managing debt, defending the dollar, and securing resources for creditors? Once you understand that wars are financial instruments, not just military events, the entire world map starts to look different. Not borders, balance sheets. Not armies, asset protection. Not victory, revenue. Here's where it starts. July 1944, a resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. The war's still raging in Europe and the Pacific, but American and Allied officials are already planning what comes after. They create two institutions that will reshape the planet: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This isn't about charity, it's about architecture. They're building a financial system where the US dollar sits at the center of everything: trade, credit, reconstruction, power. Right after the war ends, the US rolls out something called the Marshall Plan. Over $12 billion in aid flows into Western Europe. That's massive money for the time. But here's the thing. It's not a gift, it's leverage. Those dollars come back. They create dependencies. They lock countries into a dollar-based system where American banks, American creditors, and American institutions hold the keys. This is the blueprint. Wars destroy, debt rebuilds. And whoever controls the debt controls the future. Look at what happened after World War I. Germany gets crushed with reparations. The whole economy collapses. Hyperinflation, desperation. And that desperation becomes fuel for the next war. The Americans learned from that. They didn't want another Versailles. They wanted something smarter, something sustainable. So instead of punishing countries into the ground, they rebuilt them, but on American terms, with American money, through American-led institutions. Wars stopped being just about winning battles. They became engines for expanding sovereign debt, creating dependencies, and locking regions into a financial order that benefits the creditor at the top. And the US was now the creditor. This is when conflict becomes predictable, profitable, a product you can finance, manage, and profit from over and over again. Fast forward to 1971, August 15th. President Nixon goes on TV and drops a bombshell. The US dollar is no longer convertible to gold. The Bretton Woods system, the one that tied currencies to gold through the dollar, is dead. Now we're in a pure fiat system. The dollar's value isn't backed by gold anymore. It's backed by trust and demand. So how do you create demand for a currency that's not tied to anything physical? You tie it to the one thing every country on Earth needs: oil. Enter the petrodollar. By the mid-1970s, the US cuts a deal with Saudi Arabia and OPEC. Here's the arrangement. You sell oil in dollars, only dollars, and in return, we'll protect you, militarily, politically, economically. Suddenly, if you want to buy energy, and every modern economy runs on energy, you need dollars. That creates automatic structural demand for US currency, and that demand gets recycled. Oil-producing countries take those dollars and buy US Treasury bonds, which means they're lending money back to the US government. It's a closed loop, a system that makes American debt cheaper to service and makes the dollar indispensable. And that's why the Middle East becomes the most fought-over region on the planet. It's not about democracy. It's about keeping the petrodollar system alive. The Gulf War, Iraq, Libya, these aren't random. They're about making sure oil stays priced in dollars and that any country trying to break that system gets reminded hard why that's a bad idea. Energy security isn't just about having oil, it's about controlling the currency that oil is traded in. Because once that system breaks, the entire debt structure that funds the American empire starts to wobble. Let's rewind to the 1950s. Korea, then Vietnam. On the surface, these are ideological wars: communism versus capitalism, freedom versus oppression. But underneath, they're the testing ground for something bigger: a permanent war economy. Before World War II, the US military was relatively small. After the war, it never shrunk back down. Instead, it became a fixture, a constant. Defense spending didn't spike during crises and drop afterward. It stayed high, year after year after year. Why? Because an entire industry grew up around it. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. These companies don't just make weapons, they make money, billions of dollars in contracts, and those contracts are paid for with borrowed money, US Treasury debt. President Eisenhower saw it coming. In 1961, in his farewell address, he warned the country about the military-industrial complex. He said the relationship between the Pentagon, private defense contractors, and Congress was becoming dangerously cozy. He was right. Here's how it works. A war starts. The government borrows money to fund it. That borrowed money flows to defense contractors. Those contractors build missiles, jets, tanks. The war continues. More contracts, more debt, more profit. And the people who run those companies? A lot of them used to work in the Pentagon or Congress. It's a revolving door. You leave government, you go work for a contractor. You leave the contractor, you go back to government. And the whole time, the incentive is the same: keep the system running. The Cold War made this permanent. NATO expanded. Proxy wars popped up all over the globe. And every conflict, no matter how small, justified more spending. Vietnam alone cost hundreds of billions. Adjusted for today, we're talking trillions. But the defense contractors, they thrived. And the debt? It kept growing. That's the model. Conflict isn't chaos, it's business. Now let's talk about the big ones: Iraq, Afghanistan. Post 9/11 wars that were supposed to be quick, surgical, decisive. They weren't. Brown University did a deep study on the costs. They found that the US has spent around $8 trillion on these wars. Not just the fighting, also veteran care, interest on the debt, long-term obligations. $8 trillion. Where did that money go? A lot of it went to private contractors. Between 2020 and 2024 alone, private firms pulled in about $2.4 trillion in Pentagon contracts. Companies like Halliburton, BlackRock, Vanguard. They didn't just support the war effort, they profited from it. Reconstruction contracts, security services, logistics, infrastructure. And here's the kicker: a lot of that work was funded by debt. The US government borrowed the money, handed it to contractors, and those contractors turned it into profit while the taxpayer got stuck with the bill. But it's not just about money, it's about resources. Iraq has oil, lots of it. Controlling Iraqi oil fields meant controlling a chunk of the global energy market, which means maintaining the petrodollar system. Afghanistan? That's even more interesting. For years, people thought Afghanistan was just a strategic buffer, a place to fight terrorism. But then reports started coming out. US officials, geologists, international media, they all started talking about something else. Afghanistan has minerals, rare earth elements, lithium, copper, resources essential for batteries, electronics, modern technology. Estimates put the potential value at over $1 trillion. Now, were those resources ever successfully extracted? Not really. Security made it almost impossible. But the fact that they were there and that everyone knew they were there adds a whole other layer to why that war lasted 20 years. Followed the receipts. Every war since 1945 leaves a money trail, and when you follow it, you don't find noble causes. You find creditors, contractors, resource maps, debt obligations. You find business. Now let's talk about a different kind of war, one without bullets. The IMF and the World Bank, those institutions born at Bretton Woods, became tools of influence that didn't need armies. Here's how it works. A country gets into financial trouble. Maybe there's a crisis. Maybe their economy tanks. They need money fast. So they go to the IMF. The IMF says, sure, we'll lend you money, but there are conditions. Those conditions are called structural adjustment programs. Cut government spending, privatize state assets, open your markets to foreign investment, devalue your currency. Austerity. On paper, it's supposed to stabilize the economy. In practice, it often transfers wealth out of the country. It gives foreign corporations access to resources and industries that were previously protected. It limits what the government can do for its own people. Critics call it financial colonialism because it does what empires used to do. It controls a country's economy, its policies, its future, but without needing to occupy the land. You don't need troops when you control the debt, and the leverage is enormous. If a country doesn't comply, the IMF can cut off funding. Other international lenders follow. The economy collapses. So most countries comply. This is how you expand influence without firing a shot. You make countries dependent, you shape their domestic policy, you open their markets, and all of it is built on debt. Human Rights Watch has written extensively about how IMF austerity measures hurt the poorest people in borrowing countries, slashing healthcare, education, social services, while protecting creditors. The IMF defends the model. They say it's about long-term stability, about preventing worse outcomes. But the pattern is clear. Debt becomes leverage, leverage becomes control, and control becomes a form of empire that doesn't need flags or soldiers, just signatures on loan agreements. Let's jump to 2008. The global financial system nearly collapses. Banks fail, markets crash, governments scramble. And the solution? More debt. Central banks, especially the Federal Reserve, unleash something called quantitative easing. They print money digitally and use it to buy government bonds and other assets. It's a way to inject liquidity into the system, to keep things moving, to prevent total meltdown. But it also expands the money supply in ways that were unthinkable before. Trillions of dollars created out of thin air. And it works, sort of. The economy stabilizes. But the debt keeps growing. Then 2020 hits. Pandemic, lockdowns, another crisis. More quantitative easing, more borrowing, more money printing. At this point, the debt spiral is undeniable. And other countries are watching. China, Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa. They see how the US uses the dollar as a weapon. Sanctions, freezing assets, cutting countries off from the global financial system. And they start asking, why are we still playing this game? That's when BRICS starts to matter. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, begins talking seriously about creating alternatives, trading in their own currencies, setting up their own payment systems, reducing dependence on the dollar. It's not a fast process. The dollar still makes up around 58% of global foreign exchange reserves. It's still dominant. But that number used to be higher, and it's slowly ticking down. De-dollarization isn't happening overnight, but it's happening. And every time the US uses sanctions as a geopolitical tool, it accelerates the process. Countries start thinking, if the dollar can be weaponized against others, it can be weaponized against us. Better to diversify, better to build alternatives. The world is quietly, slowly moving toward a multipolar currency system, and that threatens the entire debt structure that's funded American power since 1945. Because if the dollar loses its reserve status, the US loses its ability to borrow cheaply. And if it can't borrow cheaply, it can't sustain the military, the alliances, the global presence. The empire runs on debt, and debt runs on dollar demand. Take away the demand, and the whole thing wobbles. So what comes next? Honestly, the next war might not look like a war at all. No tanks rolling across borders, no airstrikes lighting up the night sky. Instead, it'll be digital, financial, a war fought with currencies, payment systems, and central bank policies. We're already seeing the pieces move into place. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Governments around the world are developing them. China's already testing a digital yuan. Why does that matter? Because a digital currency gives governments direct control over money flows. They can see every transaction. They can freeze accounts instantly. They can enforce policy in ways that were impossible with physical cash. And in a world where finance is the battlefield, that's power. Then there's the petro-yuan. China trying to get oil traded in yuan instead of dollars. It hasn't fully worked yet, but they're pushing. Gold reserves are rising again. Countries are buying gold, not as much as they used to, but enough to signal something. They're hedging, preparing for a world where the dollar isn't the only game in town. And trade blocs are forming. BRICS is expanding, new members joining, new partnerships forming. The global trade routes that used to run through dollar-denominated systems are slowly being rerouted. It's not dramatic, it's incremental, but it's real. And if the shift continues, the US loses the financial leverage that's allowed it to project power for the last 80 years. The next war won't be about oil fields or territory. It'll be about who controls the rails that money runs on. And the prize won't be land. It'll be liquidity, legitimacy, the ability to settle debts and move capital without asking permission from Washington. Wars are no longer fought merely on maps. They're fought on balance sheets. The battlefield is global finance. The soldiers are currencies, and debt, not territory, is the prize. Once you follow the money, you never see world events the same way again. Every conflict, every intervention, every alliance, there's always a financial engine underneath. Because war, since 1945, hasn't just been about winning. It's been about managing the system, expanding credit, securing resources, protecting the currency. And the countries that understand that, they're the ones writing the rules. The ones that don't, they're the ones paying the bill. So here's my question for you. Do you think the next major conflict will be kinetic, actual war, or financial? A currency collapse, sanctions spirals, and digital control systems? Team kinetic, team financial, or something else entirely? Drop your vote below. Genuinely curious where people land on this one.